Welcome to the Air Raid Hour, a Cover One Network podcast. Here are your hosts, Judge Mathis and Tilt Money.
Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to the Air Raid Hour presented by the Cover One Sports Network. My name is Steve Mathis. You can find me on Twitter at The Bills Guys, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Dave Tilton. You can find him on Twitter at Tilt Money. Those of you who are watching on YouTube notice I don't have any video this evening. I am doing this show remote. I'm actually in Buffalo. Dave, this might be one of the only times we ever do this podcast in the same time zone. So my apologies for not being on camera this evening and for maybe not having the greatest audio, but we're going to power through this evening, Dave, because Buffalo Bills training camp is right around the corner. Rookies report tomorrow to St. John Fisher, Tuesday, July 18th. Veterans report next Tuesday, July 25th. And the first practice of the Buffalo Bills training camp is next Wednesday, July 26th at 9:45 a.m. We have made it. How you feeling?
We got through our little summer break, which was much needed. Definitely, you can feel the calendar turning, right? We're getting to the point now in the summer, you get to mid-July, you can start to kind of feel some of the excitement in the air. You got a lot of fantasy football talk starting up. You got training camp talk starting up. We're starting to really dive in on the storylines like we're going to talk about tonight. Eric and Anthony have been having Bills players in on the film room during these summer months when they have a little bit more availability. And it's just like, you can feel the excitement building, but I also think there's some tension building as well. Not necessarily that there's tension inside the Bills building, but there's tension, I think, and maybe tension's the wrong word, but a little bit of like uneasiness with the fan base to an extent that there is a lot of expectation on this team this year, much like there was last year, but perhaps now going into this year, maybe taking a step back a little bit and kind of recalibrating and kind of figuring out what this team really needs to be. And so training camp, like you said, just over a week away, we are ready to go. We're excited.
Yeah, tonight's show topic, we're going to be covering all the various different training camp storylines for the defense. And next week, we're going to be doing the same, but we're going to be talking about the big storylines for the offseason. So if you are with us here live, hit us up throughout the show in the comment section, sharing what you'll have an eye on in training camp this year. And if you're watching after the fact, on demand, comment on this video with your list of top training camp storylines. We will read those throughout the course of the week, and we will get back to you. And obviously, before we get cooking too much tonight, this show is brought to you by Picasso's Pizza. 4 great locations in Williamsville, West Seneca, Lancaster, and Blaisdell. Buffalo Pizza since 1980. You can order online at picassospizza.net. And if you're an out-of-towner like us, you can even get it shipped to your home. And I can tell you from experience, it's just as good as getting it fresh from the restaurant. Again, that is picassospizza.net. All right. So, Dave, again, this evening, what we want to talk about is we want to talk about all the various different storylines for the Buffalo Bills defense heading into training camp. And I want to start with a conversation on Sean McDermott, because he takes over as the defensive coordinator from Leslie Frazier. There has sort of been this narrative for years that it's not Leslie Frazier's fault when fans get mad at the Buffalo Bills defense, because this is, finger quotes, Sean McDermott's defense. Leslie Frazier has just been running it. So training camp maybe will be the start to sort of showing us how true that narrative or untrue that narrative in fact is. So what are your early thoughts as we head into training camp? What are you going to be looking for in regards to Sean McDermott taking over the helm at defensive coordinator?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much we're going to really know in training camp other than maybe some interesting tidbits around like where guys are lining up, right? It'll be interesting to see if like the quote starting defense has Taylor Rapp maybe is involved somehow, or which starting linebacker is there that could give you some indication, like whether it's AJ Klein or maybe it's one of the smaller guys like Williams or Bernard, maybe give you a little bit of indication of where McDermott might be headed with this thing. But I think for me, we've reached a point with Sean McDermott and him kind of taking back over this defense where he's now been the head coach of this team since 2017, getting his feet under him as a head coach now in these last several years. He has to feel right. Every season's uncomfortable and every season has its moments, but he has to feel now like he's got a pretty good handle on running this organization through training camp and into the season. So maybe it's actually a good thing that the timing worked out the way it is, because he's kind of got the quote head coach aspect of this maybe down a bit. In-game management decisions aside, I know people have issues with that, but now turn his attention to really potentially make this defense more special than it already was statistically, right? And maybe go beyond just some of the statistics on DVOA and things like that, and add some wrinkles into this defense, add some maybe exotic looks, add some different types of packages, be a little bit more aggressive. Now, in training camp, I don't know how much we're going to really know from the start, maybe not until that first preseason game, but alignments, who's getting reps where, I think will start to clue us in maybe on what his plans are for this defense. And I think it's a big year for McDermott, right? Like, this team has had a lot of success with Josh Allen at the helm. The defense has had a lot of success statistically, but in some of the biggest moments, especially in playoff games, this defense has come up a little bit short. So with McDermott now at the helm, there's nowhere else to finger point now at this point. It's on Sean McDermott, not only as the head coach, but also as the guy running this defense with, might I add, as we're going to go through tonight, a ton of really good personnel.
Yeah, I mean, you made the comment. All eyes are going to be on Sean McDermott this season, and that's going to start next Wednesday when training camp kicks off. But you also mentioned, like, who knows how much of what we'll actually see in training camp. The Buffalo Bills are notoriously secretive about what they let fans see, what they let the media see. Obviously, when you have training camp, you're going to have to let people see some stuff because you can't keep it all hidden. But even if it isn't until week 1 that we see it, I'm definitely looking to see what wrinkles that Sean McDermott adds to the defense. Do we see more exotic blitzing? Do we see maybe some more dime packages and Taylor Rapp get put on the field? And we're going to talk about Taylor Rapp again when we start talking about storylines in the secondary. And are we going to see more man-to-man defense? We drafted Kaiir Elam in the first round. He was known as a man-to-man corner in college. If he wins that CB2 job like we all want him to, maybe the Buffalo Bills, with Trey White healthier this season, get a little bit more aggressive on the boundary with some man-to-man looks, and that allows the defense to get more exotic, more aggressive, and change the way it does some of its things and mix and match, etc. So all of those things will be exciting to keep our eyes on, but who knows? It might not be until week 1 that we get some of those answers about Sean McDermott. So that leads us now to the defensive line and some of the things and some of the stories that we're going to be keeping our eye on for the defense heading into training camp here. And I think number one thing on my mind personally, everyone's going to be on Von Miller watch. All eyes will be on Von Miller. Every beat reporter will give you about 45 seconds to a minute of Von Miller on the sideline on a bike B-roll. Every single day, there will be videos and photos of him stretching. Those are the type of things that we're going to be seeing from training camp until he actually gets removed from the PUP list, which we're assuming he's going to be placed on Wednesday, and actually gets into practice. So Von Miller made some comments to Tom Pelissero last week. He's like, listen, I'm gonna be patient. I'm not going to rush myself back. What are your thoughts on Von Miller watching, what to expect from that next week?
As much as fans wanted to have Trey White back for week 1 last year, we always knew that was going to be a long shot, and really getting Trey back in the middle of the season was fine, right? Von Miller, when it matters, right? The Bills are going to need Von Miller for the second half stretch of this schedule, which is brutal, and the playoffs. Now, I'm not saying that he's not capable of being back week 1. Of course, I'm hoping that he is back for week 1. But if he's not back for week 1, I'm not really going to lose a ton of sleep over it. Like, my main thing is, like, I want him to be 100%. And the difference, I think the main difference between Vaughn and Trey here, and I think in this situation, is that Vaughn's gone through these injuries before. I think from the mental side of it, it seems like Vaughn, because of his experience in going through the injuries and other injuries previously, he's a little bit ahead of the curve mentally, I would say, than Trey was coming back from his injury. So I don't think there's going to be as much of a mental hurdle, if any, for Vaughn to clear. I think for Vaughn, it's going to be 100% a physical hurdle. And if all things check out physically, like, there's no reason to not put him on the field. The Bills have a very tough schedule. I know the second half of their schedule is a lot harder than the first half, but they need to get wins, and they need to get wins early in the season, and they need to get wins to kind of potentially buffer up for what could be a tough second half of the season. So there's two really trains of thought here. Have Vaughn back week 1. Ideally, that's great, and we can maybe stack some wins with him helping us close out some games, or you have him back for the stretch run and in the playoffs. The single most important thing for this season in the Bills is that Von Miller is available come playoff time. Now, I don't expect it to take that long. Obviously, I don't even expect it to take as long as Trey White did to come back. But if he's not ready by week 1, I'm not going to worry. And RJ says here, I bet Vaughn is back week 5, gets ramped up over the course of 3 weeks. And obviously you have that situation where you can start, you can, take him off the physically unable to perform list. And that opens up that 21-day window for the Bills to make that decision. So there's really like an extra 3-week buffer in there as well. I don't think it's going to take that long by everything we've been seeing and hearing. It seems like Vaughn is closer to returning than not. So I just hope he's back in the early stages of the season, whether it's week 1, 2, or 3 or 4. I'm not going to be too worried about that.
Yeah, Jessica Tennis comes with a great comment. She says, don't let Vaughn play in New Jersey on that MetLife turf week 1. And, RJ hits the nail on the head too. And he says that makes the most sense what RJ says. Like, sit him out a couple of weeks, give him 3 weeks to ramp up, and then get him on the football field for the second half of the football season. Make sure he's ready for the postseason. He sort of echoed those comments to Tom Pellisario and sort of laid out that that's maybe what he expects. But in reality, if he gets to camp and we're a week and a half in and the doctors are like, nope, you're good to go, well, then he's good to go. There's no sense in working him back slowly if the medical professionals do not deem it necessary. So it's just going to be a week-to-week thing, and it's just going to be every week waiting for a Von Miller press conference, every week waiting for a Sean McDermott press conference, every week waiting for a Brandon Beane press conference, and waiting for a new piece of information, a new piece to the puzzle to figure out when exactly it is Von Miller is getting back on the football field. And that leads us to the second major storyline of this defensive line heading into training camp, and that is Gregory Rousseau and Leonard Floyd. It's going to be really interesting to see how these two guys work off of each other, because these are going to be the 2 starting edge rushers to start the season if Von Miller is not ready to go. So again, it's not the easiest way. It's not the easiest to gauge a defensive lineman in the preseason because you're not really seeing anything exotic, but it's still going to be really interesting and intriguing to keep our eyes on those two throughout training camp and throughout the preseason.
It really is. And might I just add this little banner thing you've got added to the show at the bottom is a nice touch. I really like that. I like that. Man, how happy am I that we signed Leonard Floyd? Really happy. I think that, I mentioned it on prior shows. I think it could go down at the end of the season as one of the most underrated signings the Bills made the entire offseason. I think knowing that you have a guy of Leonard Floyd's caliber there to kind of be that buffer at the beginning of the season if Vaughn's not ready. He's played with Vaughn. He knows what he's supposed to do. He's a great complement to a guy like Rousseau, who is more of that lengthy sort of edge setting type of guy, and potentially maybe adding some more pass rush repertoire to his toolbox this year, as he just mentioned in the film room with Eric and Anthony. But having Leonard Floyd opposite of him, and then you add on top of that, when Von Miller comes back, this 3-man rotation, we're starting to talk about guys like AJ Epinesa, Boogie Basham, Shaq Lawson as kind of being like that last wave through and not having as much pressure on them. So for me, I think really great to have Rousseau and Floyd to open the season. What is going to be interesting is to see if AJ Epinesa and Boogie Basham can capitalize on maybe limited reps that they might get due to that fact. So I'm really excited about Floyd. I think it was a great signing that the Bills made. I think they saw what happened last year when Vaughn went out and not really having that finisher per se. And obviously Leonard Floyd isn't Von Miller, but he's probably the second best pure pass rusher on the team right now, besides Von Miller. So really welcome addition. And I think Brandon Beane really has been toying and tinkering with this defensive line for every year. It seems like he's been the GM, and every year we feel like it's pretty good on paper. But I do think this year, with a healthy Vaughn, this could be the best top to bottom defensive line group we've had in Brandon Beane's tenure. And there will be a lot of pressure on this defensive line to perform with Vaughn back. We heard all last training camp at the early stages how great the defensive line was looking. So I'm expecting more of the same. Rousseau going obviously into his next step of his progression, hopefully, and then Floyd as that vet to buffer for Vaughn. It's a good situation, I think, for the Bills right now.
And Jessica Tennis comes in and says, hoping Vaughn and Phillips start on the PUP list, carry 4 DTs and 7 DNs to start the season. And again, it's kind of, we don't really know whether Phillips can be put on the PUP list or not. It's all dependent on whether he practiced during the spring. Obviously, that might be a better question for like one of the beat reporters who are on the ground. I'm not 100% sure if Phillips has practiced yet, but Miller certainly is eligible for the PUP list. And the Buffalo Bills have a lot of depth at the edge. And that's another big training camp storyline. Charles G comes in and says, interested to see AJ Epinesa in a contract year as a potential breakout candidate. Because if you look at it, really, it's Von Miller when he's healthy. It's Leonard Floyd. It's Gregory Rousseau. And then who's the next guy? It's everyone assumes it's AJ Epinesa, right? But you also have Boogie Basham and you also have Shaq Lawson. So there really is that 3-way competition for the 4th spot. And in reality, until Von Miller gets back, it's a 3-way competition for the 3rd and 4th spot between Epinesa, Basham, and Lawson. And it gets super interesting because, you know, maybe you can cut Shaq Lawson and put him on the practice squad, but you're not cutting Boogie Basham. You're not cutting AJ Epinesa. Those guys then become trade chips if they cannot win their battles in the preseason. So Epinesa versus Basham versus Lawson should be interesting as well.
Yeah, and I think it'll depend on what the Bills are really looking for from that 4th guy. I mean, you figure that on pass rushing downs, obviously Floyd's going to be in there. You would think on a pass rushing down, perhaps that, you know, they would not want to take Gregory Rousseau off the field early in the season if Vaughn's not back. Perhaps it's a situation where you do have a package where maybe it's Greg Rousseau kicking inside with Ed Oliver, and then you have guys like Floyd and Epinesa on the edge. Like it could set up for some interesting opportunities for a guy like AJ Epinesa. But you're right. I mean, RJ's right. He's going to have to capitalize on some of these opportunities he's going to get. I do think he's probably the leader in the clubhouse, so to speak, for that 4th spot. However, it's not a guarantee, right? And if the Bills are thinking like, well, we need someone more, maybe they need someone more for early downs to kind of set the edge, against the run, and then have guys like Floyd, come in on 3rd downs. Maybe it's a guy like Shaq Lawson playing on early downs still. We just don't know. I'm not saying by any means Shaq's a lock to make the team, but he has shown his ability to set the edge against the run. And maybe at the beginning of the season, the Bills will value that on early downs. So it'll be interesting to see where this lands for AJ Epinesa. I feel like Boogie Basham's kind of like, I don't want to call it the odd man out, but it's like, what is he going to be for this defense? Is he going to be like that Quentin Jefferson type where he's kind of like an inside outside type of guy? Like I'm struggling to figure out what Boogie Basham's role is going to be. Whereas at least I can like somewhat define roles for AJ Epinesa and Shaq Lawson. It's hard for me to figure out exactly what Boogie Basham's role will be. Now, you mentioned they have depth, so it's not a bad problem to have, but could he be a guy that's a trade chip at the end of camp? Like, I don't know. The Bills are willing to give up on him that early, but there's a lot of a lot of chatter, especially from fans, about
Mhm.
trading either one of Boogie Basham or AJ Vanessa, which is, in my personal view, I wouldn't trade him. I would want to have the depth assured to me before we knew what was going to happen with Vaughn. Maybe Vaughn is back and that gives them the clarity they need. But right now, I'm just not ready to go there yet.
Yeah. And we still have Kingsley Jonathan and Shane Ray, two wild cards who could throw a wrench into all of this, right? If one of those two guys has a big preseason, we've already seen Kingsley Jonathan claimed once coming out of training camp when he was waived and signed by the Chicago Bears, claimed by the Chicago Bears, made his way back to us. And Shane Ray's got that former first round pick pedigree. So if one of those two guys or both of those guys blow up in the preseason, you know, get some tape out there, make some highlights, get some buzz around their name, maybe they'll force the Buffalo Bills' hand and they have to trade a Boogie and cut a Shaq to keep one of those guys who really come on. So the Buffalo Bills really do have a lot of depth at the edge position, and it's going to be one of the most intriguing positions to watch this year at training camp. But that we're not done with the defensive line yet, right? We just spent the last 10 minutes talking about just the edge rushers. We're still talking about we still got to talk about the interior defensive line as well. And this is where it gets super interesting. For me, it starts with Ed Oliver and playing under his new contract. To me, for the Buffalo Bills, this is a big year to prove something. There's a lot of players who are coming in with something to prove for the Buffalo Bills this year, whether it's Ed Oliver trying to live up to this new contract, whether it's Matt Milano having to play for the first time without Tremaine Edmonds, Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer playing past 30, coming back from injuries, Trey White coming back from an injury. There's a lot of sort of guys with things to prove, guys with chips on their shoulders, guys with some redemption arcs on this defense this year. And it really does, to me, start with Ed Oliver, because if you look at it, he hasn't been able to stay healthy, so that's something to keep an eye on throughout training camp, throughout the preseason. And he's been outplayed by all the other defensive tackles taken in the first round of his draft class. Quinnen Williams, Christian Wilkins, Dexter Lawrence, and Jeffrey Simmons. So Ed Oliver is coming into camp. What Ed Oliver are we going to see? Are we going to see an Ed Oliver who gets paid and takes his bag and just sort of gives up, the Marcel Darius? Are we going to see a guy who gets the bag and just keeps being who he is? Or are we going to see a guy who gets the bag and on top of that has something to prove and takes the next step of his development? That's going to be something really, really interesting to watch.
Yeah, what is it? I mean, overall contract value, $30 million less, I think, than what Quinnen Williams just got, something like that. Ed Oliver was in the 60-something million range, which is nothing to laugh at, but Quinnen up near 100. Obviously, well-deserved. He was a top five draft pick. But you mentioned those other players, and I think the last thing you cannot see any regression from what he was the last few years, right? Like you mentioned, like, is he going to be the same guy that he has been? That's the bare minimum, and it's probably not going to make a lot of people happy, right? I mean, I think that most people, and we probably could go back and check receipts, but I think most people probably figured like he was not going to be in the Bills' future plans, right? I mean, like, I think a large percentage of people just figured he was going to be gone, or not necessarily that they wanted him to be gone, or didn't think the Bills were going to pony up for what dollars he was going to command. Who knows in a year or two's time if those dollars end up looking like a somewhat relative bargain, if he can actually kind of flash at a more consistent level. I know that's kind of like a contradictory statement there, but he needs to have more impactful plays in games, and I think he needs to be a little bit more consistent. And I'm not saying he needs to all of a sudden become an all-pro, right? That's not what I'm saying, but I do think he needs to have a bit more consistency and needs to be a guy that can affect games, right, in big moments. And that's something that I'll be looking for. I'm not going to worry too much about Ed Oliver's box score statistics. A lot of people want to kind of like look at him as an interior pass rusher and kind of project sack numbers for him. And we've been guilty of that as well, doing that. But like for me, it's going to be like, can he make big plays in big moments of games? And that's to me where I'm going to want to see him. Like we talk about Vaughn being the closer at the edge, and he's kind of built that reputation over years of doing it. Can Ed Oliver kind of be that closer from the interior late in games and kind of make life really hard for opposing quarterbacks late in games when teams are potentially trying to come back or sustain drives against the Bills. That's what I'm going to be looking for from him this year.
Another big story along the interior of the defensive line is the addition of Poona Ford. He's another exciting veteran player that the Buffalo Bills got for a bargain in free agency. And we all saw last year the impact that the addition of Daquan Jones had. So really, if you look at Poona Ford, the big question going into training camp, going into preseason, entering the regular season, does Poona Ford give us another Daquan Jones type of difference maker? That's definitely the number one thing I'm going to have my eye on when watching Poona Ford next week and in the coming weeks in training camp.
Yeah, playing the same position, but I think, obviously not the same body type, body style, right? Daquan's a fairly taller defensive lineman. Poona Ford's pretty short for a defensive lineman weight-wise. I think they're, fairly similar, but not exactly the same body type of providing you the same position depth at the one tech as I'll call him a true one tech. I think this is something the Bills have been lacking and something that they had been a little bit hesitant to fully dip their toes in, right? They've been kind of trying to sign these sort of tweener type guys like a Tim Settles or Jordan Phillips who can play both, but really are better suited to play three tech. I think Poona Ford does give the Bills a little bit of insurance, and that's totally right here. Low man wins equals Poona, and that's why like shorter interior defensive linemen can be successful in the NFL because of that leverage that that Douglas was alluding to there. And so it's a really nice addition. Another one of those that didn't happen in the early waves of free agency, kind of happened later in free agency, sort of I think it was like shortly before the Leonard Floyd signing. So again, the depth on this defensive line, we've talked about edge. Now we talked about interior, giving a running mate to Daquan Jones, Ed Oliver now having really kind of solid true depth behind him and Tim Settle and Jordan Phillips. Like it is shaping up to be a really good defensive line. Obviously health is a huge factor here, but like if this group can gel together and they finally have the right mix of guys, it can be a really special defensive line. And I like the Poona Ford move.
It also come together too, right? If Jordan Phillips stays healthy, that's really scary. If Tim Settle can go back to how he played in Washington and maybe live up to that contract, he is another body in there as well. But at the end of the day, Poona Ford, Daquan Jones, Jordan Phillips, Tim Settle, they're all in the final year of their contract. So the last major storyline to me, and this one might seem minor, but to like roster freaks like us, this is like one that we're going to possibly be honing in on. I'm really going to be keeping my eye on the bottom half of the depth chart at defensive tackle. Not so much the Kendall Vickers of the world, because those guys are a little older. Eli Anku, those guys are a little older. But I got my eye on three guys specifically. At three tech, Cortez Broughton, a guy who I liked a couple of years ago coming out of Cincinnati. The Buffalo Bills claimed him. He's about a 290-pound three tech. They also have Cameron Klein, who they picked up off of waivers from the Colts. There are questions about whether he's a defensive end or a three tech. He's kind of got that Boogie Basham type of body. So it'll be interesting to see where he lines up when training camp starts. And at one tech, the Buffalo Bills have UDFA DJ Dale out of Alabama. Again, one guy next year is under contract, and that is Ed Oliver. So could a Cortez Broughton, could a Cameron Klein, could a DJ Dale, can they prove enough in training camp in the preseason to earn themselves a spot on the practice squad this year and then possibly be a rosterable rotation IDL in 2024? That's something I'm going to keep my eye on in the bottom half of the defensive tackle depth chart.
And the Bills haven't been adverse to kind of having these guys like that kind of come up at times. We've seen this happen with Brandon Bryan at times. We've seen this happen with Eli Anku at times. They have NFL snaps under their belt, right? So can these guys like DJ Dale, Cortez Broughton, Cameron Klein make that type of impact? We will see. The preseason is going to be really important for them. I expect those guys to get tons of reps in the preseason. DJ Dale's a guy I'll be keeping my eye on only because he's really the only true, I would call, one tech of the bunch at the bottom there that potentially could be maybe a successor as a backup to maybe taking Poona Ford's spot a year from now. The other thing that's a little bit, I don't know if it's concerning or not, but like I'd like to see a Daquan Jones maybe 1 or 2 year extension as well happen at some point, because like you said, Al Oliver's the only one under contract beyond next year. These guys are going to have plenty of chance in the preseason and camp to kind of make a name for themselves, but it's going to really be within that group, right? It's going to be, can DJ Dale push himself ahead of guys like Eli Anku, right? I think that's going to be the type of battle we're looking at the bottom of that DT room, which is fine, right? I kind of like maybe churning that over a little bit. We saw Brandon Bryant's no longer here. Eli Anku's still there, obviously, but like not going to lose sleep over that bottom of that defensive tackle depth chart if it gets churned over a little bit.
On to linebackers now. A ton of things to talk about. Everyone wants to talk about the middle linebacker position battle, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But I think a lot of eyes should be on Matt Milano this training camp as well. Number one, this is the first time in his career he's going to be really since his rookie year, I should say, that he's going to be playing without Tremaine Edmonds. So he's not going to have that in a new player. So to see Matt Milano communicate, maybe see him take over some of those leadership responsibilities. Do we see more looks for Matt Milano at Mike linebacker? I'm not saying we're going to Matt Milano. This gets confusing, Matt and Mike. I'm not saying Matt Milano is going to be the middle linebacker, but do we see some looks where Matt Milano shades in to the Mike? And then there's the question of the green dot, the guy who is who Sean McDermott is in his ear. Is it going to be Matt Milano calling the defense? Is it going to be whoever wins the middle linebacker job? Is it going to be Micah Hyde? Is it going to be Jordan Poyer? So that's something interesting, whoever gets the green dot to keep an eye on as well. So I think a lot of eyes on Matt Milano this training camp.
A lot of eyes on Matt Milano. And I mean, to be perfectly fair, there's a lot of pressure on him now too, I think, right? It's like him and a bunch of guys behind him. The Bills, I mean, yes, they brought in AJ Klein as another veteran, so I think that's done intentionally to not put as much pressure on Matt Milano to be the guy bringing a lot of these young guys along. So I do think a smart move by the Bills to have AJ Klein in the building. There's been chatter like maybe AJ Klein becomes that starting strong side backer next to whoever that, if it's Matt Milano at the mic. Like, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. But I do like the fact that they got Milano a little bit of veteran help to bring guys like Dorian Williams and Balon Spector and Terrell Bernard along this year, because this to me is the one area that's like, if you want to play that wild card clip, like the Charlie wild card clip, like this linebacker group and what Sean McDermott, as we talked about at the top of the show, is going to do with his linebackers in this defense now that he's calling the shots, I think is probably, as we get to not to tease too far ahead, but it's going to probably be one of the top storylines to follow during camp when you start ranking out these storylines. So it's going to be super interesting to see who gets the green dot, who's going to line up where. And this is one of those things where I thought maybe we can get a little bit of indication of what Sean McDermott's plans are with the defense as we start to see who lines up where at the linebacker position.
Yeah, Claude Puig coming in saying, I'm sure there were plays last year based on alignment where Milano was the Mike. And that's 100% true. That is the case. I just wouldn't be surprised if like that is amplified this year. So maybe instead of on 10% of the plays, it's on 30 or even 40% of the plays that you see him maybe align as the Mike linebacker. I don't think it's going to be a full-time thing. I think Brandon Beane sort of squashed that. But I think you might see it maybe more than you have years previous. And that brings us to the middle linebacker job, right? Everyone thought we were going to be drafting Jack Campbell out of Iowa. We had been scouting linebackers. We had been talking about Mike linebackers for months during the free agency process and the draft process. At the end of the day, the only addition the Buffalo Bills made were Traven Howard and Dorian Williams. So we go into training camp now, and it's Tyrell Dodson versus Terrell Bernard versus Dorian Williams versus Balon Spector for the starting Mike linebacker job. And maybe there's a chance that veterans like AJ Klein or Traven Howard can slip into this competition. So this is going to be something to monitor. Who's the first guy to line up at middle linebacker? Who's the second guy to line up at middle linebacker? Do they switch every other day? Who is it this week? Who is it next week? Who starts the first preseason game? That's going to be our new obsession for the next month and a half. That and CB2, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But what are your thoughts on this middle linebacker competition?
Yeah, I can hear it now. Sean McDermott coming out after the first practice being like, don't, we're going to just line guys up. We're going to rotate them through every day. Like, don't read too much into who's there. Like, I can already hear it happening. Like, there's probably going to be a different guy lining up starting in that with the ones for the first week of camp would be my guess. And then preseason game number 1, I think, is going to be kind of an interesting situation to see maybe who gets first crack at it. And that may tell you that there's another guy that they have already in the mix for it. If they have someone, like, what I'm saying is, if Terrell Bernard lines up as a starting linebacker in the first preseason game, I don't think that necessarily means that, like, he's their number 1 guy, right? So we might not even know this until towards the end of the preseason or right before the season of who's going to end up manning this position. So I know in a couple shows back, we had mentioned kind of who we wanted or who we thought was going to be the guy. Like, I thought at the time, maybe AJ Klein was going to be the guy to start out there. Wanted Dorian Williams to maybe be the guy, but Terrell Bernard going into year 2 probably wouldn't be fair to overlook him in this situation either. And Jessica says, I get the feeling it'll be Spectre by week 8. And the funny thing with this whole thing is like, each guy, at least before camp starts, probably has a case to make. But I think just like Brandon Beane did with the offensive line when he first got here, it was like, let's throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And having 4 or 5 guys in the competition maybe is their best way of figuring out who this starter is going to be come week 1.
And I'm getting to Jessica Ten's point here. She says she's got a feeling it'll be Spectre by week 8. I agree with her that I think maybe the starter at middle linebacker might not make his way into the lineup until maybe around mid-season. I'm getting 2017 Matt Milano vibes, right? In 2017, Ramon Humber was the starting weak side backer. McDermott stuck with Humber. He stuck with Humber. And then finally, about 5 or 6 weeks into the season, he was like, all right, Matt Milano, you're going in. And then Matt Milano really never gave up the job. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's going to be Balon Spector. Who knows? It could be. He certainly has the physical profile, and he definitely could come in and surprise. And there's certainly no one standing in his way if he wants to come into training camp and take that job. I just think it's going to be Dorian Williams. I think Dorian Williams is not going to start the season at Mike. People are probably going to be upset. It's probably going to be AJ Klein or Tyrell Dodson. And then by the end of the 5th or the 6th or the 7th week of the season, you'll get average play from one of those veterans, and the Buffalo Bills will try to switch things up. They'll throw the rookie Dorian Williams in there, and hopefully he impresses to a point where he doesn't have to be taken out of the lineup again. So it'll be super interesting to see how the Buffalo Bills approach it. And Dave, I think that over the course of training camp, as we do these shows over the next couple of weeks, I think we're going to have to do like a heat check every week and give like percentages to each player. And we're just going to have to go and we're going to have to assign a percentage to each player and just have some fun with it this preseason, because it's going to be interesting. As a fan, it's going to be stressful. So let's try to have a little bit of fun with it. I think we're going to have to do some heat checks and maybe put some percentages week by week, how things are stock up, stock down type of things every week.
You know how they do like for like, you know how they do like on ESPN or like on golf, sometimes they'll show you like the timeline and like the lines kind of intersecting with each other. Like, oh, this guy was in the lead, but then like after like this amount of time, like it was this guy, and like the lines like go back and forth. Like we probably need to do something like that for the linebackers, like each week for a heat check, and just show like the up and downs of like who is the guy at that time.
Speaking of storylines, there's plenty in the secondary as well. So let's transition now to the secondary. We'll get to the CB2 battle in a moment, but the first to me thing that I'm going to be looking at, even before CB2, is I'm going to be looking at Trey White. What is his confidence level heading into training camp? How comfortable does he look? Do we see the Trey White of old, or do we see the Trey White of last season that sort of looked like he was really struggling to come back from that ACL injury. What are your thoughts on Trey White as he enters training camp?
I don't even want to say cynical, but I'll say my realistic side tells me we might not ever see pre-injury Trey White again, but I think we'll see an improved Trey White more like we saw towards the end of last season. So I don't know that he's ever going to reach back to where he was before the injury, but I think he can get close, and I think he can still be a Pro Bowl caliber cornerback for this team. I'm not sure that he's going to get discussed as being like one of the top 5 corners in the league anymore, but I do think he's going to be back in a way that shows that he's removed from that injury even further, not just physically, but for him more so mentally, I think, right? That was like kind of the thing that I think got him and delayed him coming back to really trusting that knee and getting back to kind of like the technician that he really is. Trey relies a lot on his technique and being in position. And so for a guy like that, who really relies on fundamentals and technique, and you really need to be able to count on that knee. And I think he's at a point now where it seems like he's going to have some of that swagger back, as Nikki G mentions. I think you will see kind of that fun loving, Trey White that we so loved to see before the injury. As far as his level of play, I don't know, like I said, if it will ever get back to where it was, but I think he can get close, and I think he can be still the bona fide CB1 on this team.
Yeah, Spin and Marquet coming in saying all reports from OTAs are that he looks like he's got a step back, that he looks good, he looks great, and Nikki G says it best, right? Like, you want to see Trey get that swagger back, that confidence back, that comfortability back, so it can make the job even easier on the CB2. Jessica Tennis comes in and says, I'm more interested in Elam and Benford, and if they take steps forward. And that's a great conversation to have, because outside of middle linebacker, the other big, real competition heading into training camp is the cornerback number 2 battle. Last year's first-round pick, Kaiir Elam, versus veteran Dane Jackson, versus last year's 6th-round pick who impressed when playing last season in Christian Benford. So it's sort of a 3-way battle for cornerback 2, and this is going to be one of those ones, just like you mentioned with linebacker. Sean McDermott's going to show up at his press conference and be like, well, Dane started today, but things could change tomorrow, and it's going to be a rotation. Don't read too much into it. And we're going to be doing these weekly sort of heat checks and stock up, stock down with the CB2 battle as well. What are your thoughts on this CB2 battle?
Yeah, I mean, I think I shouldn't say everyone. I think most people want to see Kaiir Elam run away with this.
Everyone wants to see Kaiir Elam.
Well, there are some Christian Benford stands out there for sure. I don't know that there's really any Dane Jackson stands other than maybe Aaron Quinn. Although
Dane Jackson's mom.
He still would want Kaiir Elam to win that job. Look, all 3 of these guys had over an 85 passer rating allowed against them last year. So it wasn't like, any one guy really separated themselves throughout the season and the snaps that they got. Elam allowing 31 receptions on 41 targets isn't great. Dane Jackson had a pretty decent completion percentage allowed against, but all 3 of these guys did have good moments, but all 3 obviously need to take steps forward, as Jessica says. So I think everything is perceived from the vantage point of like where these guys have been drafted, right? So the expectations on Kaiir Elam are going to be higher than Christian Benford. And even if Kaiir Elam is playing, quote, better than Christian Benford, if Benford is right there with Kaiir Elam, maybe just a step or 2 behind, I think people might look at that negatively on Kaiir, just because of where he was drafted. Now, I think it's a good situation for the Bills to be in. They've got a reliable, veteran now at this point in Dane Jackson, who has been serviceable when he's been in. I know, Bills fans don't necessarily want him to be the CB2, but bringing him back was a good move. And then you have Christian Benford, who overachieved, I would say, as a rookie. We liked his traits coming out. We liked his ball skills, and that was evident. But the Bills really need Kaiir Elam to be that guy. They traded up a year ago to get him. As Charles G says, Elam will get every opportunity So if it's Dane or Benford, to me, that means they had to handily win the job. And that's true. And it's not a bad position for the Bills to be in. I do think this is a little bit different than the middle linebacker situation because I think you have a different, I think you have guys who are playing in the right position, I'll call it, like the right physical makeup, and you have guys with experience, a good mix of experience and some talent and pedigree under their belt, where you don't necessarily have that with the linebackers. You have a couple third round picks, a late round pick inspector, and some really depth chart type guys in Dotson. So CB2 is a little bit more interesting. I think the talent level of CB2 relative to the linebacker is higher. And as as Nikki mentions, like if Elam does not win this job, then one of those other guys had to have handily win it. It's a pretty good spot for the Bills to be in. And I do want to ask you this question now that we're on the secondary. We really talked about the good depth the Bills had on the defensive line, and we're talking about the depth now on the secondary. Maybe it's a question we answer after we talk about safeties, but what group do you think overall has the better depth between the defensive line and the secondary?
That's a great question. I would say the defensive line probably has better depth than the secondary. Well, I'm not concerned with the safety depth, but I think there's higher end depth at like edge at defensive tackle than you see with the Buffalo Bills safety group. But the cornerback group is really deep, and I thought Jessica Tennis made a great comment too, because when we talked about defensive line depth, we talked about possibly trading a Boogie Baction, or possibly trading an AJ Epinesa, right? Jessica Tennis comes in here with a great comment. She says, Dane has hit his high. Last year's two rookies, Benford and Elam, they still have room to grow. And if Benford and Elam grow this training camp, and they prove and they show that growth, now you have an expendable Dane Jackson, and maybe you can trade a Dane Jackson for some draft picks. And that starts to bring in some other players into the conversation as well. 7th round pick Alex Austin. Last year's UDFA Jamarcus Ingram. There were some good notes on him coming out of camp. Cam Dantzler, the former 3rd round pick, who the Buffalo Bills signed after he was released by the Minnesota Vikings and the Washington Commanders. You have some intriguing names that are going to get cut if Dane Jackson makes his football team.
Yep.
But if Dane Jackson becomes expendable and you can trade him for some assets, that also brings some other names into the conversation as well. So it gets really, really interesting, and it really is all dependent on Benford and Elam.
It is, and I think Dane Jackson does have some value in as a trade candidate, but he also came back to the Bills like someone else could have signed him, right? So it's like it's hard for me to gauge Dane Jackson's value. I don't think you're getting any more than like a 7th round pick for him in a trade. But if you can get a pick for him in a trade, and you feel like a guy like Alex Austin or someone like that can come in, and Cam Dantzler is a good one. Obviously has some pedigree, being a 3rd round pick, has talent. Didn't really work out in Minnesota. They drafted corners, what seemed like every year for a couple years there, trying to find like the heir apparent to Xavier Rhodes. But yeah, I mean, it just depends on how much the Bills value like CB4, right? I mean, in the past, we've talked about how the coaching staff here, one of the best things they've got going for them over the last couple of years is their ability to coach up maybe less, physically talented guys, doing it more with X's and O's and scheme and fundamentals with guys like Dane Jackson and Levi Wallace and guys like that. So maybe there is something to the Bills coaching staff continuing that trend and figuring they can find another guy they can coach up to be the CB4. It'll be really interesting.
Jessica Tennis comes in with another great comment. She says, in her opinion, if Elam and Benford grow into starters, then Trey White becomes tradable next year. I don't know if I like the idea of trading Trey White, but you know what I have heard from some people, and I've sort of run it by Eric and I've run it by a couple of other people and asked them if this was a feasible possibility. And they said, yeah, it is. Trey White is somebody who could transition to possibly free safety and fill Micah Hyde's role. in the future as well. So if you have guys like Benford and Elam step up and grow into starting corners, everyone wanted to talk last year about transitioning Benford to safety. Trey White is possibly a guy who could transition to safety as well. And before we get to safeties here, Pops Mafia comes in and says, Judge, do you like Jamarcus Ingram? Obviously, he went to UB. I've seen every UB game in the last 15 years. I'll tell you what, in watching Jamarcus Ingram at UB, I never thought, wow, that's going to be an NFL player someday. I never even thought he would get an undrafted contract. I thought he was an XFL player, a USFL player. I really only thought the Buffalo Bills signed him because he was a local kid. It was kind of like a pity sort of signing, bottom half of the roster. I thought he'd be one of the first guys cut. But here we are a year and a half later, and he's still here. And apparently he is really turning heads, and development is not linear. Everyone develops at a different pace. So he definitely has the physical stature and the physical acumen to be a solid corner. If he puts it all together, maybe he can be a depth corner in the National Football League. But I don't think Jamarcus Ingram will be anything more than a depth corner. I don't think that he would, be some guy who would ever come in here and compete for legitimate cornerback snaps as a starter. That leads us now to safety. And safety is an interesting conversation. Jessica Tennis comes in and says, Trey White is paid way too much to be a safety. And that's a good point as well. Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde. All eyes are going to be on them. They are back together again. Nobody thought we would ever see these two in a Buffalo Bills uniform playing side by side again. Yet here we are. The health of both are going to be a big thing to watch. More specifically, Micah Hyde and that scary looking neck injury that he's coming back from. And here's one of my bold predictions for training camp. If Micah Hyde comes back and he proves that he's healthy and he proves that he's ready to go, I think by the end of preseason, you will see Micah Hyde signed to a 1-year extension to match his contract and to sort of make his contract end at the same time as Jordan Poyer's. So that's one of my bold predictions for training camp, if he can prove he's healthy. But all eyes on Hyde and Poyer this year.
Yeah, and I think that makes total sense. I do think that the injury, like Hyde's injury, while obviously clearly debilitating, he was able to recover from it, was close to returning at the end of last season. And it wasn't like a lower body injury where it's going to really potentially hindered his mobility or things like that. Obviously anything dealing with the back neck area, you are concerned about it, but he was pretty much almost cleared towards the end of last season. Now he's had the whole off season to kind of make sure he's right for training camp. And I would imagine, like you said, if he's healthy, they would like to try to line those contracts up. And I also would imagine that with these two guys, they're not going to push them super hard in camp. I think their experience with McDermott, maybe a few new wrinkles that McDermott wants to throw in, they'll be on the field for those and kind of figuring that out. But I don't see that there's a huge need to making sure that guys like Hyde and Poyer are getting tons and tons of 100% of the reps in camp, right? You want to see what DeMar Hamlin can come back and do. You want to see if Dean Marlowe can do anything for you. You want to see what Taylor Rapp can do in those reps in whatever you're going to do with your defense. So give these guys rest throughout camp. I don't really necessarily need to see them going all out 100% throughout the summer.
And it's funny too, because last offseason was the first time where the Bills started doing that. We talked about how great that was for guys like Jaquan Johnson and DeMar Hamlin. And sure enough, Hyde and Poyer had their least healthy seasons as Buffalo Bills. And Jaquan Johnson's not even on the team anymore. But Steve Rose comes in with a great counterpoint to what I said earlier about the contracts extension. He says, you don't want the contracts to end at the same time. Better to stagger it than to be left with nothing at all once the contracts are up. So that is the counterpoint to the argument. Maybe you aren't left with nothing because maybe this player right here that Charles G mentions has a big season. The Buffalo Bills can extend him. And in 2 years, maybe he can slide into that Jordan Poyer role. And then you just have to replace Micah Hyde with maybe, say, Trey White. Look at this. It's all coming full circle here. And that guy is Taylor Rapp. Charles G comes in and says, having Taylor Rapp in the fold makes me feel so much better if Hyde or Poyer goes down. This is probably the most mysterious player heading into training camp. What is Taylor Rapp's role going to be? Did this guy who everyone thought was going to be a marquee name in free agency, a guy who was going to start for teams in the National Football League. Why the heck would he come and sign with the Buffalo Bills after we signed Jordan Poyer? So it's going to be interesting to see how he is sort of utilized in training camp. Is he rotating around between strong safety and free safety? Is he getting these like thick dime looks? How is Taylor Rapp going to be utilized on defense? Which team is he going to be lining up with? What packages is he going to be in? All of these things are on the table when we get to training camp, and it's going to be something to really keep an eye on.
Exactly. And as Steve says, Rapp's the most mysterious player, second only perhaps to Deontay Hardy. This is another one of those situations where he lines up could maybe clue you in onto what McDermott's plans are for this defense. So you start thinking about what he's going to do at linebacker, McDermott that is, and what he's going to do with Taylor Rapp early in camp. Maybe we'll start to clue you in on what his plans are for this defense. I do think that they do need to find a way to get Rapp on the field, right? He's a very good player. He's good down in the box. He's a sure tackler. He's certainly more of a box type safety than he is a center fielder, but he's okay in pass coverage. So like he's versatile enough. The Bills can use him in a variety of situations. Maybe he becomes like a dime linebacker, like you mentioned. That could be a very interesting move. Maybe him and Milano end up on the field together in dime situations as the linebackers. Like that could be interesting. But I don't know that the Bills are going to show that, especially early in the preseason. I think they're going to maybe want to keep that one a little close to the vest. So Taylor Rapp may continue to be mysterious, unfortunately, as we open camp. But let's hope maybe at least there's some tidbits that we can get from the first few practices.
And just to piggyback a little bit off of Taylor Rapp, it'll be really interesting to see whether it's Taylor Rapp or whether it's Cam Lewis or even maybe Dean Marlowe or Damar Hamlin throw their hat in this ring. Who lines up as the second team nickel cornerback? Because on paper, it's Siran Neal. But if you have Siran Neal as maybe the third team nickel cornerback, that shows you that maybe the Buffalo Bills don't trust Siran Neal as a defensive player. And maybe, just maybe, with some of these new wide receivers that we've added to the football team with special teams acumen, maybe there's a chance if the second team nickel corner is Taylor Rapp consistently week in and week out at training camp, or it's Cam Lewis. Maybe Siran Neal's job is in jeopardy. I don't think it is. I think he's pretty well entrenched as a special teams ace, a gunner, the backup nickel corner, but you never know. You never know, and that's why it'll be really interesting to see. Maybe there will be a little bit of a crack in that if somebody lines up as the second team nickel corner. The last thing I really want to talk about here when it comes to storylines for the Buffalo Bills in the secondary, it's obviously the biggest story and one of the biggest stories in the National Football League last year. Still one of the biggest stories in the National Football League. You saw it at the ESPYs, and that's the return of Damar Hamlin to the football field. Everyone's going to be wanting to see Damar Hamlin out there playing with his teammates, playing real football again, seeing live action. He told Pat McAfee at the ESPYs he is faster now than he was before his injury in that Cincinnati Bengals game. So an absolutely incredible recovery for Damar Hamlin. And it'll be interesting to see him duking it out with Dean Marlowe and Cam Lewis for that fourth and final safety spot.
It will be, and I think that it's going to be hard at times to try to separate the football from obviously what happened. It's amazing, the recovery. It's amazing that he's back on the field and competing here. I think he's probably the likely guy to get that fourth safety spot. But I wouldn't go as far to say it's a guarantee. I do think that there was a lot of promise with Damar Hamlin. Obviously, I was a big fan of him coming out of the draft. I thought that he had a lot of nice qualities. I think at times when he was on the field last year, before the injury, that he had some good moments, but he had some rough moments, right? But it's a learning curve, right? And he got some real NFL snaps under his belt, meaningful playing time, and I think that will serve him well as he goes into camp this year. And we'll obviously have a different perspective on things, as will the competition, right? And his teammates will have a different perspective on things. And if that elevates his play somehow, great. If whatever happens with him, the fact is that he was able to recover from what he did. At the end of the day, like, it's all positive for DeMar. And I mean, I think right now he's probably going to be the guy that gets that 4th spot. And I think that he will, I expect him to have actually a good training camp. I think he will be, we'll have some snippets from the beat guys about some plays that he's making during camp.
And it'll be real interesting too. That 10th defensive back battle will be interesting, because if Dane Jackson becomes expendable and you can trade him, or if Saran Neal becomes expendable and you can cut him, all hell is going to break loose. And there's going to be a whole bunch of guys, Alex Austin, Cam Dantzler, Jamarcus Ingram, Cam Lewis, fighting for jobs, right? But if not, if Dane Jackson's spot holds and you can't trade him, if Saran Neal's spot holds and you can't cut him, you have White, Benford, Elam, and Jackson. You have Johnson and Neal at corner. That's 6 dudes. Then you have Poyer, Hyde, and Rapp. That's 9 dudes. So your 10th guy is probably going to be a safety, and it's either probably going to be Dean Marlowe or DeMar Hamlin. So that should be super interesting. I think most of us would assume right now, before seeing them in training camp, just what you said, that if DeMar Hamlin comes back and he is the DeMar Hamlin of old, or a better version of DeMar Hamlin, he's going to get that spot, and Dean Marlowe will be sort of that like veteran practice squad type of player. All right. So we have brainstormed just about every single possible Buffalo Bills training camp storyline for the defense. And I want to remind people who are listening on demand, or even people who are listening now, come on back to this show after it's done live, and in the comment section, leave what you think are the top training camp storylines, the top training camp storyline, or the top 2, or the top 3. Leave your list of the top training camp storylines and why you think these are the top training camp storylines. Dave, I believe you said that one of the people in our chat here tonight, Pops Mafia, has a little something for us that we can give away this evening. And what we're going to do, and Dave's going to tell us what it is we have to give away, but what we're going to do is, if you come back to this show and you comment in the comment section after the live feed is over, you will be in the running to win this prize that'll be raffled off. And Dave, what is this prize that Pops Mafia has so generously offered up for us to raffle off this evening?
Yeah, Pops and I, we DM on Instagram quite a bit. He messaged me before the show tonight and said he has 2 general admission training camp tickets for August 3rd's session that he's willing to donate to the show, to the Air Raid Hour, that we can give away to one of our listeners/viewers. So we will, as Judge said, be giving away 2 general admission training camp tickets for August 3rd session, courtesy of Pops Mafia, based on, if you go back and comment on the show on YouTube, all you have to do is comment with your top training camp storyline for the defense, or really just whatever, top training camp storyline. If you comment on that on this show, you will be eligible to be entered into the contest for the free giveaway, and we will announce the winner on next Monday's show, July 24th, when we break down the offensive storylines.
Yeah. So again, thank you, Pops. Super generous of you. We really, really do appreciate that. And before we wrap things up this evening, Dave, let's take all of the storylines tonight, and I want you to try to rank them like 1 to 3, and you can combine some of the storylines as well. So it doesn't have to be all the different minute individual ones that we went through tonight, but like, what are the top 3 things that you're looking for as the Buffalo Bills head into training camp?
Yeah, so top 3 on defense, right? I think number 1 has to be Von Miller, right? All eyes are going to be on Von Miller. What's his participation like going to be in camp, if at all, right? Is he going to be on PUP? Is he not going to be on PUP? All eyes are going to be on Von. I think this storyline kind of doesn't go away, but it kind of moves off to the side if he ends up on PUP, right? I think it kind of becomes like a secondary storyline, because then at that point his fate's a little bit been sealed, right? At that point. So until that time happens, I think that's probably number 1 for me. Number 2, I think for me will be the CB2 battle. I think I want to see Kaiir Elam run away with that job. I want to hear glowing reports from the beat guys, from whoever is there at camp. Our guys will be there as well at these practices. I want to hear nothing but good things about Kaiir Elam in that CB2 job. And then I think number 3 is probably going to be what, just because of the money, right? I think it's going to be Ed Oliver, right? Like, what's he doing at camp? Is he getting the better of Mitch Morse? Is he getting the better of these new additions at guard in Connor McGovern and Osiris Torrance, right? Like, battling these guys throughout camp. Ed Oliver with that new contract, how is that going to play out in these early camp battles? And so I know middle linebacker is kind of like a big deal for a lot of people, but I feel like that's going to be quite a gray area, right, for most of camp. And I don't know that, like, we're really going to get a ton of clarity on that. So I know it's going to come as a surprise to some people that I'm not putting that sort of in my top 3, but I'm not going to put that there. And then I guess for honorable mention, I'll just kind of say the safeties in general, because obviously you have the Poyer coming back unexpectedly, Hyde coming back after that injury, and then DeMar, obviously a storyline in himself, coming back from what he did. So that's going to be really interesting for me to follow. And then, yeah, the middle linebacker situation, I'll probably put just to round out a top 5 list if I was going to have one.
Yeah, Thomas Burke comes in and says his big 3 are DeMar, Vaughn, and Trey. Steve Rose, he's got blinders on, man. He's looking just for those inside linebackers and what the inside linebacker competition looks like. Nicky G coming in, he says his number 1 is linebacker, and his 1B is going to be the usage of the safeties. And Jessica Tess comes up with a question here. She says, when do players be placed on PUP? Before the first practice. So that's sort of like they practice at 9:45 on Wednesday morning next week. My guess is anyone who goes on PUP will be announced like in the press conference before they hit the field. Like Sean McDermott will probably talk to the media. He'll announce it. The team will put out a tweet, a press release, whatever. My guess is it'll happen either Tuesday night or Wednesday morning before they head out there for the first practice. For me, my top 3, number 1 is just like you. It's going to be Von Miller. Watch. This guy was brought to the Buffalo Bills to put them over the top. We had this conversation all last year. I can't wait to see Von Miller put the Buffalo Bills over the top. He's the player we need in the playoffs. He's the icing on the cake. And he was all of those things in the Kansas City game, right? He's the one who got his hand in the face of Patrick Mahomes, him and Matt Milano, and it forced that turnover to Teron Johnson. He showed it on the field, the kind of closer that he is against a big-time team, and then we didn't have that in the playoffs because of his injury. So getting him back, getting him healthy, that's the number 1 most important thing for the defense. So that's obviously the number 1 most important thing that I'm selfishly going to have my eyes on as well as you. Number 2 for me is going to be the 2 legitimate position battles, middle linebacker and CB2. And then number 3 for me is going to be any of the new McDermott wrinkles that we might be able to get our eyes on, whether it's more exotic blitzing, which I doubt we'll see in training camp. Maybe we'll see some dime looks that sort of brings the Taylor Rapp aspect into all of this. And maybe we'll see some more man-to-man looks. I think dime looks and man-to-man looks, those are things that we'll be able to see with our eyeballs at training camp and understand if the Buffalo Bills maybe are going to be implementing more of those things when the season starts. So those are the things that I will have my eyes on. All right, Dave. That just about does it for this evening here on the Air Raid Hour. Hour 10 in, maybe a couple more minutes left here. Any final thoughts? Anything you want to say to wrap up the show? You want to have a little DeAndre Hopkins conversation, talk a little Madden ratings? The floor is yours. What is anything left you want to talk about here this evening?
Well, as far as DeAndre Hopkins, right, like you went for the money, right? I mean, I know there's been chatter about like, okay, history with Houston and a little bit there with Vrabel. Like, okay. Like I can see those dots being connected, but let's be real, dude. You went there for the money. Like you didn't go to win a ring. You didn't go to Tennessee to win a ring. You didn't go to Tennessee to play with great quarterback play. I know I'm not trying to shit on Ryan Tannehill or Levis or whoever ends up being the quarterback there. But you took the money and that's fine. I mean, probably would have done the same thing. You're getting one last paycheck. on your way out, no problem. Look, as far as wrapping up the show tonight, talking about the defense was something that I think is maybe going to be overlooked. Not overlooked is the wrong way to put it, but like everything we talk about with the Bills generally starts and ends with Josh Allen and kind of like the offense and him and Stephon Diggs. But I think that this defense with McDermott calling the shots, with the personnel that the Bills have this year with Von Miller, I think it could be really special. And the Bills could be in a position where they're in a really, really advantageous situation where they have an elite level top one quarterback in the league with a top receiver, great offense, and then pairing that with a potentially very top rated defense, and not just statistically, right? I'm talking about stylistically as well, coming through in the big moments and being there, making big plays, and not just having that box score statistics sort of carry you through. Like we've seen the Bills have good DVOA defensive statistics over the last couple of years, but when it's really mattered, I want to see this defense shine, and I think they could have hopefully the right formula this year. So I'm excited about the defense this year, and yeah, looking forward to talking about offense next week.
All right. Before we head out here, Pops Mafia with a great comment, because we're not really talking special teams, right? Tyler Bass is locked in. Sam Martin is locked in. Reed Ferguson is locked in. So it's always going to be interesting to see who is taking the punt and kickoff returns. A little bit of intrigue this year. It's going to be Nyheim Hines, who I think is personally the dude, and I think is going to be the dude. But Deontay Hardy, do the Buffalo Bills have special teams plans for a guy who, even though he's electric, just like Isaiah McKenzie was electric, Deontay Hardy has 7 career special teams fumbles, which is not something I think the Buffalo Bills are on board with. I am team Deontay Hardy as an offensive weapon. He might be used occasionally on special teams. This is Nyheim Hines' job. It's not in jeopardy. Where do you stand with the kick and punt return battle, which is also something to keep an eye on?
I think Hines has to be locked in. Obviously, the Bills are going to need to have someone else take reps back there if they want to get Hines involved a little bit more in the offense as a running back. But I think it's Hines is going to be locked in. We saw how great he was when the Bills put him in that position after the trade last year. Thoughts of them spending a ton of money on this running back, but really, like, for that peace of mind to have as the returner and the guy that can play running back, it's his job. I do like the idea of using Hardy on offense, and it'll be interesting to see how the Bills use guys like Hardy and Shakir this year, sort of those second rung of receivers that they've got. But I think it's going to be Hines, but if Hardy gets reps at camp, it will not surprise me in the least.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Awesome in the comment section, as always. We will be back next Monday to preview training camp storylines, just like we did tonight, but for the offense. And again, when this show is over, head on over to the comment section and tell us what your top training camp storylines are for the Buffalo Bills this season on defense. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, go Bills.
Go Bills.
Thank you for watching tonight's episode of the Air Raid Hour. Make sure to hit that like button on the way out. If you are catching the show on demand, leave a reply in the comment section and we will respond over the course of the week. You can always listen to every episode next day on all major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify, by searching Air Raid Buffalo. Thank you for your continued support, and as always, go Bills!